generated. The wastes that are generated at the earlier stages and in some aspects of even nuclear power production are referred to as low and intermediate level waste. And the waste that comes at the far end as it comes out of the reactor is called nuclear fuel waste. And it's high level radioactive waste. So we start in Canada. We have the entire nuclear fuel chain in Canada. We start with uranium mining in Saskatchewan. We have 200 million tons of radioactive tailings in the Elliott Lake Basin from when we had uranium mines operating in Ontario. Now all the uranium mined in Canada is being mined in Saskatchewan, although we have a number of exploration projects for uranium throughout the province, and including a number in the northwest and more mostly concentrated in the Elliott Lake area in the northeast. So if uranium mining and the milling happens in Canada, in every instance it happens on site or at a nearby mine. So it's mined, the ore is mined, it's taken and it's milled, so it's turned into a what's called yellow cake, a yellow powder material that then comes from Saskatchewan to a uranium refinery in Blind River, where it's refined. There's a number of issues around the Blind River refinery, increasing levels of uranium concentrations in the soil, and those come from increased and increasing emissions, both as they increase production and add more low-level radioactive waste to the waste stream that's being burned in the incinerator in Blind River. Then it moves down to Port Hope, to the conversion facility. Lots of issues there around the contamination, particularly of the Port Hope harbor, and waste issues throughout the community. Then fuel fabrication, then it moves on to the reactors. We have reactors operating in Ontario at 3 different stations, at Bruce, Darlington, and Pickering. All of the low and intermediate level waste from those reactors are shipped to the Bruce generating station, but the fuel waste, the high level waste that comes out of the reactor, it goes first from the reactor. When it first comes out of the reactor, it is very, very hot, radiologically very hot, and in terms of heat temperature also very hot. You cannot have human contact or human exposure. It is literally lethal within less than a minute of exposure. So it goes from the reactor after about 18 months in the reactor into a cooling pond, into a cooling pool, where it stays on average for about 10 years, in many instances longer. It has to be in there for about 8 years, and it cools there. At the nuclear power production stage, we also have the offshoot, of course, when Canadian uranium goes internationally for use in weapons production. There's not a country in the world, not a uranium producing country in the world, that acknowledges that their uranium goes to weapons production. But Canada is the largest uranium producing country in the world. And you know, because of the way the market works and the way the supply chain works for weapons production, we can be pretty confident that Canadian uranium is going into weapons. When the waste comes out of the pools, right now where it goes, if it leaves the cooling pools, it goes into dry storage at the reactor station. So we have a number of reactors and all around the Great Lakes, and all of the waste is stored on site there. All of the fuel waste, the high level waste, is stored on site at each reactor station. Unlike the low and intermediate level waste that they move to a centralized location, it all stays there. The reactor communities have been told for really, I think, as long as they've been reactor communities, that the high level waste will leave. And so even though the industry says that the waste is safely managed, that there's proper containment, that it's isolated from the environment and so on, the reactor communities are told and are expecting that that nuclear fuel waste will leave their community at some point in time. Nuclear reactors work like really large, really expensive, relatively unreliable kettles. You put a fuel bundle into the reactor, a number of fuel bundles into the reactor, create a fission process, creates heat, creates steam, turns a turbine, you get electricity. It's a very complex technology used to boil water, to create steam, to create electricity. Unlike other ways we might make electricity, we are left with a legacy of nuclear fuel waste, which is really a legacy that lasts forever. Nuclear waste is a problem for numerous reasons, most of them related to its longevity and the degree of hazard associated with it. So it's extremely long-lived, it's extremely hazardous, it has both radiological effects, and there are, with the waste over time, also concerns about the release of the chemical constituents of the fuel bundles. It must be strictly isolated from the environment for, virtually into perpetuity. It's really, you can average it out and say forever, because when you look at the longevity of the hazards, it's beyond really, I think, our ability to imagine that amount of time when you look at the longevity of these wastes. So each of the wastes, in the fuel waste, there's about 250 radioactive isotopes. So you have two different hazards in the waste. You've got the radioactive hazards, which are radioisotopes, and then you've got the chemical hazards. So the radioactive isotopes have a half-life. Each isotope has a different half-life, and it can be very, you can get into a very complicated exercise of trying to, understand each of the isotopes and how each of them break down, and what the decay chain and so on is. Really, as citizens exercising a concern and engaging in, a debate and a decision-making process about that level of detail is really not necessary to us. We do need to understand a couple of things about it. So each radioactive isotope has a half-life. That half-life means that it's the amount of time it takes to reduce itself to half of its volume. The way it reduces itself to half its volume is by putting off energy and, moving into its next decay product. So uranium-238 decays into thorium-234, decays into protactinium, into uranium-234, and so on. So each one, as it decays into the next daughter, it gives off energy. And that's where the radiological effect comes from. That's where that concern about the radiation comes from, is because these products, as they decay, are giving off energy at each case. And each of them has a different amount of time. So you can see some of them are hours, some of them are tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years. And so those all tell us different things about the speed and intensity with which they give off that energy. Even really low levels of radiation, even low doses of radiation emitted by the waste or by any other radioactive source is a health concern. They can cause cancer, they can cause birth defects, they can cause other health problems, mostly associated with the immune system and the breaking down of the immune system. We tend to talk a lot in terms of, maybe not in our day-to-day, everyday conversation, but the industry tends to characterize risk in terms of deaths per million. So when we were in a 10-year review of the last version of a nuclear industry proposal to bury nuclear waste, the numbers the industry was giving was 3 deaths per million would be the estimated effect of a nuclear waste repository. But the deaths per million, whether it's 1 or whether it's 2 or whether it's however many, is only part of the picture, because there are a lot of other hazards, there's a lot of other health effects which are sublethal. It affects your immune system. So things like asthma, allergies, all those conditions are related to immune disorders and a weakening of our immune systems. So it's not just whether it's going to, you know, whether you're going to get a cancer and die. It's whether you're going to get a cancer and suffer really, you know, difficult times and have your quality of life affected, or whether you're going to get asthma or more allergies or, you know, any number of other kinds of disorders. So even low levels of radiation have a potential health effect. Now, there used to be, I guess, what we would characterize a debate, although I'm not sure how much of a debate it was. There was a large group of the scientific community that said there was no acceptable exposure level, and there was, you know, some in the scientific community who said that there was a threshold effect, that you could be exposed up to this level with no, you know, predictable outcome or harm. There was a National Academy of Sciences, a very conservative scientific group in the United States, and they have done a series of studies and reports on the biological effects of ionizing radiation. So ionizing radiation is the kind of radiation that you get from a nuclear facility, from nuclear waste or from other nuclear materials. And they had done a series of studies. In 2005, they came out with what I think everyone has accepted as a final conclusion. And their final conclusion was that there is no acceptable level. There's no level of exposure that you can go underneath and you can't expect there to be a health effect. It doesn't matter that, it doesn't mean that every person who's exposed will have a negative health outcome, because we're differently affected, we're differently vulnerable. So women are more vulnerable than men, children are more vulnerable than women, children in utero are more vulnerable than young children or growing children. So we're differently vulnerable, and there's all kinds of other factors that affect us. But what was significant about the BR7 report is that it said, from a very conservative scientific group, that there is no level of exposure to radioactivity, to radiation, that can be said to not be without a health concern. So where did the problem come from? We have been generating nuclear waste as long as we have been using fission products. So it all began in 1945 with the first time we had a criticality event in Canada with an experimental reactor, and we've just kept going from then. So 1945 we had the first instance of nuclear fission, and we've kept going. We've been building nuclear power stations. We began production, you know, pre-commercial production in the 60s. Later, the first commercial production at Douglas Point, and then we've been bringing more reactors online until the early 1990s. So in that time, we've generated 2 billion bundles. The 2008 number was 2 million bundles of nuclear fuel waste. It's about, I think, about 2.2 now. There's, I think, 85,000 bundles per year, I think, are generated. It's approximately 50,000 tons. The industry always likes to describe it as, I think it's if you could stack it like cordwood, it would fill, I think it's 6 hockey rinks up to the board. Of course, one of the difficulties is you can't stack it like cordwood. It has to be spaced, it has to be, you know, it has to be shielded. So it's a bit misleading to say it's just like 6 hockey rinks, and that's not that much. We'd all like to have 6 hockey rinks in our communities. Right now, the waste is all storing in cooling ponds, cooling pools, or in dry storage at the 5 nuclear stations. through this period, while we've continued to just generate the waste and build up the waste, we have been having a series of, I would call them policy discussions, or, you know, policy bursts, maybe. So in '77 was the first time in Canada that there was an actual public kind of discussion. And it wasn't that public. It was 3 men for 3 months studied the problem of nuclear waste and its long-term management. And they decided after 3 months that underground disposal in a geological formation was the best option, based on their 3 men for 3 months. And that is the idea that the nuclear industry has stuck with ever since. Many might remember in the late 70s and early 80s, there was a number of communities that were subject to research drilling. Atomic Energy of Canada Limited came into many communities in northeastern and northwestern Ontario. They stayed longest in Atikokan and Massey. After the fact, they described it as having been a research project, but at the time, I'm told that the community's understanding was very clearly that it was not for research, it was for selection of a nuclear fuel waste repository location. It didn't go very well in the late 70s and early 80s. The communities organized, they opposed, and in the end, Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, which is the Crown Corporation, whose mandate is to develop and promote nuclear technology. They're publicly funded to develop and promote nuclear technology, and they were also given the job of figuring out what to do with nuclear fuel waste. And it didn't go very well for them, looking for a community, going into communities, so they switched strategies. And in the late 70s, began developing their generic concept. So through the rest of the 80s, Atomic Energy of Canada Limited focused on developing what they called the generic disposal concept. And it was a concept, an idea of burying nuclear waste 500 to 1,000 meters below the surface in a granite formation in the Canadian Shield. And it would be in a titanium container in boreholes in the floor, although as an alternative they were also, they also considered in-room placement of a copper canister. That was the idea. In 1988 it was referred for federal environmental assessment. There was a 10-year review, 13 months of hearings. There were hearings here in Thunder Bay in 1996. Also in January of 1996 in Thunder Bay, and 1997 in Thunder Bay and Atikokan. In 1998, the federal panel came out with their findings. They had been asked, the key question was, has the Atomic Energy of Canada Limited concept been demonstrated to be safe and acceptable? And the summary answer was no. It hasn't been. And the Seaborn panel came out with, some language around it, but basically what they said is they didn't demonstrate it to be safe from a social perspective or acceptable from a social perspective. And they said in terms of the technical acceptability that, I put the words on the screen, it's on balance adequately demonstrated for a concept. So I think faint praise, and there was a scientific review group that came up with a list of, I believe it was 65 technical deficiencies. So really that should have been a no-go. The panel also made a number of recommendations which were as important, I think, as their having said that it wasn't demonstrated to be safe or acceptable. And one of those recommendations was that the future work around long-term management of nuclear waste should be handed over to an independent agency, which is arm's length from the nuclear industry, with a board comprised of stakeholders representing a range of interests and perspectives. The federal government responded by saying, We agree with those in principle. And then they created legislation that passed in 2002, which actually accomplished pretty much the opposite. So through the Nuclear Fuel Waste Act in 2002, the Nuclear Waste Management Organization was created. The Nuclear Waste Management Organization is comprised completely of the nuclear industry. The majority of board members are Ontario Power Generation, formerly Ontario Hydro. They own 90%, they generate 90% of the nuclear waste in Canada. Then Hydro-Quebec and New Brunswick Power also have a seat. Ontario Power Generation basically runs the Nuclear Waste Management Organization because they have the controlling interest and they occupy the chair. Nuclear Waste Management Organization was told in the Nuclear Fuel Waste Act that they were to look at 3 options for the long-term management of nuclear waste over 3 years, and there were a number of other things they were supposed to do as well. They sort of did most of them, although not to the extent that I think was expected of them in some of the really key areas. So they were supposed to look at continued storage at site, centralized storage, and geological disposal as per the ACL concept, as the 3 options that they looked at. They really did only a very desktop exercise, particularly on the 2 concepts which were not geological disposal, which were not about burying nuclear waste somewhere in a rock, probably in the Canadian Shield. They spent 3 years doing that. They had a very carefully managed process. They had a number of focus groups. They did public opinion polls. I think it's accurate to say that they did not hold a single meeting where they didn't know that they would have at least as many supporters of the ACL concept as they had critics. And that's just something that we surmise from the number of meetings that were canceled because they said they couldn't get the attendance, and we knew who had said yes, and we could only guess that the people who had said no were the supporters of their preferred option, which, not surprisingly, when they came out with their report in 2005, the preferred option was a nuclear waste repository in a rock formation, a little bit different from the ACL concept, because instead of the granite formations of the Canadian Shield, which we had been hearing for years, they said that the rock formations of southern Ontario, central and southern Ontario, were also acceptable, which I think just further supports our assessment that really any rock will do. Through the 10-year environmental assessment hearing, it became clearer that they were relying much more on what they called their engineered barriers, because they had not been able to demonstrate that rock actually acts as an effective barrier for radionuclides moving out from a repository to the, to the biosphere, to the environment where we all live and which we all rely on. So they had become increasingly reliant and emphasized the engineered barriers. So basically the copper canister with a number of other materials in layers. So it really wasn't surprising when they said, oh, and by the way, we've added on all of the rock formations in addition to those of the Canadian Shield, because I don't really think the geological media is I don't think even they would say that it's that reliable, although certainly their materials say that it's reliable. So that is 2005, they recommended what they called adaptive phased management, which is they described as combining all of the options because the waste continues to be stored on site. Of course it does until the repository is ready. They said there was an option of moving it ahead of the repository actually being ready, which would be the centralized option, and then finally a geological repository, burying it underground. Also, an important way that it's different from the ACL concept is Atomic Energy of Canada Limited always talked about being able to create a repository which they would put the waste down in, they would seal it up, and it would be isolated. Well, they had difficulty defending that, convincing people of that during the 10-year review. Nuclear Waste Management Organization has responded perhaps to that, perhaps for other reasons. They have said that rather than sealing it up and, you know, walking away at the end of the operational period, they're actually going to leave it open for 240 more years so the community can decide whether they close the repository at that point. So that's approximately 300 years from now. So that's the Nuclear Waste Management Organization proposal. They call it adaptive phase management. This is their words. And adaptive phase management really is the Atomic Energy of Canada Limited's idea, the Hare Report's idea from 1977, with a couple of modifications that come in response to a couple of the challenges the industry has faced over the last few decades. So in May 2005, they released it. It was 2 years later till the federal government responded. That was in 2007. In our view, this fourth option, what they call the fourth option, adaptive phase management, is a combination of the worst of those first three. One of the things that, you know, is troubling about this is this notion of, there are many things that are troubling about it. Pretty much every aspect of it is troubling. But, you know, in terms of the differences between the old ACL idea and this idea is this notion that they could actually move it to a centralized location prior to a repository actually having been investigated, a potential repository site actually having been investigated. So this is, the language they use is that it is a national infrastructure project. So this came out in 2005. I don't know if that wasn't so much the language then, I don't think, but you know, it responds to the infrastructure spending across the country, and it really makes it sound like a very nice project that I think every community would want to have, because I know all the communities in Northern Ontario would like some infrastructure funding. So this is a national infrastructure project. This is the ACL description. It's $16 to $24 billion, and it's to be hosted by an informed and willing community. It looks pretty much like the same graphics we saw in the 1980s from the industry proponent at that time. So you have above ground, a surface facility that's, and then an underground with shafts down to an underground facility. The underground facility is, I think it's about 6 square kilometers. The above ground facility is, I think, 250 hectares. So it's a fairly large footprint, and it's similar to the, you know, the sort of the geological approaches that are put forward by countries, by several other countries around the world, and that is that you have shafts or borehole shafts, and you move the waste down and you place it in rooms or in boreholes in the floor, and it's a multiple barrier, so there's copper and bentonite clay, and that forms what they describe as a multi-barrier approach. So key concerns. You know, one of the concerns that I think is maybe most obvious is that this having a solution, being able to say that they've gotten to yes, really clears away one of the industry's longest standing and biggest public relations problems, because it is a real concern in the public that there is not an answer to the long-term management of nuclear waste. People know that it is extremely hazardous, that it's extremely long-lived, and that you know, even if they don't know all of the language and all of the words around it, they know that it needs to be kept isolated from the environment. And that's a real challenge that the industry has faced. So by solving that problem, industry, I think, will see that as a green light for continued and even expanded nuclear production, for more reactors. Another concern is that economically vulnerable communities will come under pressure to accept the nuclear dump. And whether that pressure comes from outside, from the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, or whether it comes from inside, it'll probably be a mix of both. The process will be, we can be fairly sure, divisive, destructive, very, harmful to the social fabric of communities. Some of us have been through siting processes for other kind of facilities in the past, and it really is very, very hard on a community. Even if the community in the end says no, they've still gone through that very, divisive period as a community, and there's a social cost to that. There's a cost to all of those residents who really have to engage in that debate. And it takes time and it takes effort. It's time away from families, it's time away from jobs. And when you have a proposal like this come to your community, people generally feel like they have no choice but to get involved. And that has a cost. That has a human cost and a social cost. Another key concern, of course, is that the eventual repository ultimately, eventually, it will release harmful substances to the environment. In the 10-year hearing on the ACL concept, the debate was not about whether or not it would leak. The industry did not say that it would not leak. They don't call it a leak, but they don't say that it won't leak. The debate was about how much, how soon, and what effect. But they didn't try to say that it would actually contain the waste forever. And the Nuclear Waste Management Organization doesn't say that it will contain the waste forever. They say it'll contain it for a long time. But long really isn't long enough with these materials. And another concern, and this is I think going to be a concern for many, many communities in Northern Ontario, if any community steps forward to be considered for this, and that is the impacts along the transportation route. The work that has been done by the industry to date on transportation in Canada, I don't think has been that helpful. It's tended to come to a conclusion that it really won't, it's not that much of a problem. The work that's been done in other jurisdictions where the authorities or agencies weren't as keen on the idea, like in the state of Nevada, those studies by an independent source actually provided some pretty good insights into some pretty serious concerns about exposures to the populations en route, and particularly moving through urban areas in case of accidents, worker exposure, and so on. So the Nuclear Waste Management Organization's fourth option really does, I think, combine the worst of all those three options. And each of those concerns that we've identified are all going to be very much at play with the nuclear waste management option. So where they're at right now is they began their siting process in 2007. The announcement of their siting process being launched was within the same week as the federal government announced their having accepted the concept or having accepted their report. The federal government accepted the Nuclear Waste Management Organization's recommendation and their 2005 report, even though it was incomplete, and they did it without any other consultation, public consultation, and they did it refusing to even send it to a standing committee of Parliament. So the federal government really just accepted this report, put it on the shelf for 2 years, brought it down, stamped it, and handed it back. I expect there was a little bit more communication between the industry and government during that period, but from the outside, that's what you could see. 2008 and 2009, they spent designing their siting process. building the organization, and in late 2009, they finalized the siting process, and they launched the site search in 2010. So this is, this is from the Nuclear Waste Management Organization literature. This is what their timeline looks like. So they're spending some time, a couple of years doing the report, a couple of years designing the siting process, and then they predict that it will be 10 years or more to actually find and seal the deal with a repository community, the receiving community. They would call it the host community, the willing host community. I think the receiving community is probably a more neutral and appropriate term. So the way the process works is right now, so in May, they were at step 1, and they're going to continue step 1 until they actually have a signed deal. So step 1 is their broadcast. That's when they just go out and talk it up. They haven't talked it up as publicly as I actually expected they would do. They've been talking it up at through the municipal associations, through, they've set up a municipal forum, but they will not disclose, even in direct questioning, who's on the forum, what they discuss, when they meet. So they've been taking a much more one-on-one approach to soliciting interest in this. That's what they call their broadcast. By their documents, they describe it as when they, set out the information more generally to interested Canadians, and in particular to what they call accountable authorities, municipal councils. Step 2 is when they do the initial evaluation. So step 1, they put the word out. Step 2, a community steps forward and saying, we're willing to be considered. Have a look at us. And that's where we're at right now with 3 communities, with Ignis and Ear Falls and Pine House, which is a community in northern Saskatchewan. So we're at step 2 right now, and that's supposed to be 2 or 3 months. There's no requirement for the accountable authority, for council, to actually engage the community. No requirement for the Nuclear Waste Management Organization to engage the community. It's really a discussion between the elected officials and the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. Step 3, if the community is, sort of passes that initial evaluation, then they go into a preliminary study that takes a couple of years. It's only at step 4 that transportation route communities, surrounding communities would actually be involved in the conversation. Step 5, the community makes a decision. So by the NWMO process, we're 5 years, 6 years from now before the council or the accountable authority is actually required to canvass the community. Now, you would expect that most councils would want to do that a lot sooner, but they don't have to by the NWMO process. So step 5, step 6, they sign the deal. They get a contract, they get a commitment from the community, and again, it's the council who would do that. Then step 7, they begin the actual detailed technical evaluation. They've done a preliminary evaluation that's taken a couple of years, but it's only after they've signed the deal with the municipality, after the community has committed themselves in contract, that they would then actually investigate that candidate rock and see if it's got the characteristics and so on. And it's only after that that they do the environmental assessment. So a community is being asked to sign the deal, make a commitment before they actually, either they or the industry really understands the site and whether it is appropriate even by the industry's characterization. So where we're at right now is we've got a couple of communities have already identified, and the NWMO has said that they're not going to share any information about who they're talking to, who's expressing interest, until they formally go into step 2. And they've said that that's because they want the communities to have the privacy to have these conversations themselves, which means they really don't want any outside independent information coming into the communities prior to them making that commitment to the process. Now, according to the siting process, communities are supposed to be able to opt out at each stage. But I think that it's still problematic that we have an organization which describes itself as being open and transparent and puts those as principles of operation and is very opaque around the very important questions such as who's expressing interest, and is very selective, I think, in the information they're providing. Earlier this week, I went to both Ear Falls and Ignis in a very preliminary way. These are communities that I think that many of us are going to be traveling with as long as they're in this process. We're going to walk with them. I think that's our responsibility as people who have followed the issue and gone through the discussions. Many people in this room went through those discussions when Atikokan was in, the earlier round, and we've got that responsibility. So we went to Ear Falls and Ignis on Tuesday and Wednesday of this week with a couple of really modest objectives. One is to start a communication with the libraries who we are working with to set up a reference file where citizens, local folks, can actually access a range of different kinds of materials, independent materials. We've provided a really recent report that does an assessment of the technical shortcomings. Conclusion is basically the technical case hasn't been made for geological disposal. There's a whole list of issues that are really unresolved, things like unanticipated corrosion of the containers, and the bentonite clay is under testing being shown to not have the kind of retention ability that it was predicted to have. There's a whole bunch of technical issues that just haven't been resolved. And in addition to all of the other social issues that we might point to. So that kind of report, a couple of reports taking doing an analysis of the NWMO process itself. So we established we're working with the libraries to create a reference file that people can access there, and went and had a look at what information the Nuclear Waste Management Organization is actually making available in each of the communities that have stepped forward in the Northwest. So this is actually the booth that's set up in the rec center in Ear Falls, and it's available for 2 hours, 2 evenings a week in the rec center. And we've got some of the materials here, and you can get all of the materials there that are on the website. They're all on the Nuclear Waste Management Organization website. And exact same setup is in the municipal office, open during business hours, Monday to Friday, in Ignis. So that was another objective we had, was to just see how's the information being presented, what's the range of perspectives, and really the only perspective being presented is, not surprisingly, the perspective of the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, and to see how available it is. And I don't think probably 9 to 4 or 2 evenings a week is all that available to lots of people who live in those communities. But those are the information kiosks that the Nuclear Waste Management Organization has created. And our third objective was just to start making contact with some of the local residents and start having a conversation about what's the mood in the community, what might be helpful to the community, what really is the level of or the intensity of the discussion. And so that was really helpful. And it's really helpful, maybe helpful is not the right word. It so happens that there are people in each of those communities who have already dealt with siting processes. The low-level radioactive waste siting process in the early 1990s had Ear Falls on the list, and Ignis was one of the communities that was at least investigated in a preliminary way by Atomic Energy of Canada Limited in the early 80s. So there were people in those communities who have some experience. We often get asked the question, so what should be happening instead? So I think that it will not come as a surprise to you at this point in our conversation that we are not supporters of this concept of geological disposal, of burying nuclear waste in a rock formation. We don't think it's technically sound, and we think that there are many problems that just don't need to be taken on in terms of the hugely increased difficulties in mitigating it, in responding to any unexpected differences in monitoring results and so on. It just, you know, after many years of this being promoted by the nuclear industry in many countries, the technical case has still not been made. And I think it's really time to just, you know, accept that and move on and put our resources as a society, put our resources elsewhere in terms of dealing with this problem and dealing with it, you know, as a real problem rather than a public relations problem. So what should be happening instead? First step is to stop production. In any other waste management process, you always start with a couple of basic principles. Reduction, you know, that reduce, reuse, recycle. There's a reason that reduce is first. So reduction, you stop production and the second principle of waste management that I think really applies here is you deal with the waste as close to source as possible. So without an early phase out, the volumes are going to double. We don't have a viable option in terms of the geological disposal concept. So we're only increasing our problems when we go to really the only option that we have available to us in real terms right now is, regrettably, continued storage at site. And it's not a good solution because those wastes are going to have to be monitored and managed at those sites for as long as we can imagine. And there are lots of questions and issues and challenges there, but those reactor sites are also going to remain contaminated, and they're going to have to be managed into perpetuity as well. So the bad news is that there's no good news on this. And pretending that we have a good news story by having a new graphic design and packaging for a 30-year-old idea of burying nuclear waste in a rock somewhere far from the halls of power doesn't make it a good idea. Even if it's the only idea that the industry is putting forward, it doesn't make it a good idea. So what can we do? Well, we've got to really engage. We've got to engage with each other. We've got to engage with the communities who might be considering this. We've got to engage with the decision makers. We don't need to become experts. We don't have to be able to recite the decay chain for each of the 250 different radioactive isotopes. We don't need to do that, but we need to engage. We need to, take up the history, look to the future, and really take some responsibility for the final outcome, because ultimately it'll be a political decision. And we really need to support the communities who might find themselves embroiled in this process over the next however many years. And my sense is that the Nuclear Waste Management Organization will continue their broadcast activities. You know, so if Ear Falls and Ignis decide to opt out at stage 2, then another community will at some point probably come forward, and then if they opt out at stage 3, another community will come forward. I don't think this is going to be over very soon. The Nuclear Waste Management Organization says, you know, 10 years for the whole process to site it, and then, you know, 30 years later it will be built, and you know, they'll have an outcome. I don't know that it's going to go that quickly. So I think we should just settle ourselves in for the long haul and treat each other with respect and just say no. So thank you all. I think we'll take a short break, a couple of minutes, and then have a conversation. So.